Hello and welcome to the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 83, brought to you by Wicked Tree Gear. Today we're jumping into part number 2 of our Deer Movement DIY Report mini-series with Dr. Bronson Strickland. So stay tuned. All right. What is up, everybody? Hope everyone out there is having a good Wednesday. Hope you're getting a chance to get into the timber. Hope some of you wrapped some tags around some deer. Definitely have been seeing some deer hit the ground here on social media. A couple buddies of mine have actually tagged a couple nice ones. Got to say, I'm just a little bit jealous. Would love if the weather would start to, I guess, make a turn for the better, to be a little bit more accommodating for hunting season here, man. It's been in the 80s, high 70s and 80s. It doesn't really make you feel like it's time to hit the timber, but there is a cold front a-coming this weekend. I'm debating whether or not I'm going to hit the swamp, because I do have those couple big deer that are in the swamp that I'd still like to chase, but there's a really nice temp drop that's happening in Ohio, and I'm really tempted to jump in the truck, maybe take a day on Friday off of work, get out there late Thursday night, and maybe hunt Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, because the weather is looking pretty choice for the area that I'm going to be hunting in Ohio. So thinking about making a quick trip out there this weekend. We'll see if that comes to fruition or not. But regardless, be getting out into the timber this weekend because the weather looks like it's going to be favorable at least, and try to get some, if nothing else, just try to put some meat in the freezer. That's usually I try to make that my goal at the beginning of the year, but a couple of these bigger deer have kind of had me preoccupied, I guess, so to speak. So I've yet to put any meat in the freezer, and so maybe I should make that the goal this weekend. Maybe I should just concentrate on doing that. But today we have a cool show. Have part number 2 with Dr. Bronson Strickland talking about deer movement. The first part, if you haven't listened to yet, I highly recommend you go back and check that out. He's a wealth of knowledge. PhD, knows his stuff whenever it comes to when it comes to talking deer. But the first part we did was really talking more about deer movement at a higher level, excursions and things like that. When you're talking about I guess what I would say is more of a herd dynamic and just how deer move in general. This next section, part number 2, is really we're starting to now focus more into singular deer and how specific deer might move, or how different conditions might make deer move. So for example, precipitation or barometer, barometric pressure. We talk a little bit about the moon. I know that's always a fun topic to cover because there's a lot of folks who are believers, and then there's a lot of folks who are non-believers. So it's interesting to get a scientist's perspective on what impact, if any, that the moon has. And that's really what we're doing today, is really going to kind of look at how deer move individually and what might trigger them to move, as well as the lengths of periods of movement as well. Or I guess maybe a better way to put it is when does their movement start to ramp up, and when do they become most active during the course of the season? Because I think, a lot of times folks think that, certain parts of the year, whether it's the quote unquote October lull, that they see less and less deer movement. But a lot of the stuff that I've seen, or seminars and stuff that I've sat in on, like, you typically will see, increased movement throughout the year. So the lull isn't necessarily a lull in deer activity. It's a lull in us, I shouldn't say you, but us as hunters seeing it if we're not in the right places. So really cool conversation with Dr. Bronson Strickland. Looking forward to part number 2 here. Hope you guys enjoy it. But before we jump into that, let's take a quick second to talk about our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. First and foremost, we are brought to you by Wicked Tree Gear, the longest, fastest cutting, toughest tree trimming equipment you have ever used. Simply put, the toughest saws on earth. How tough are they? Tough enough to come with a lifetime warranty. And right now, when you visit wickedtreegear.com, use the promo code TRUTH at checkout and get a 20% discount on your Wicked purchase. We're also brought to you by Exodus Outdoor Gear. The Trek comes in at a $145 price point and has the same proprietary shell design as the Lift 2 series camera. Same 5-year warranty and unmatched customer service policies, photo, video, time-lapse, and hybrid modes, all with a single backlit LED display. You also get about 20,000 images on one set of lithium batteries, which is pretty kick-ass. I just checked checked cameras here, I guess 2 weeks ago, man. I don't even know how long these cameras have been up, but I still had like 30-40% battery on every camera. So if you'd like to learn more about Exodus trail cameras, check them out at exodusoutdoorgear.com. If you like what you see, save yourself $20 and use the promo code TRUTH at checkout. We're also brought to you by Glacier Coolers. This is the time of year when you're getting ready to go on hunting trips. Maybe you're tagging some game. You need to keep it cold and unspoiled on your trip back home. This is when a Glacier Cooler would come in handy. Whether you're hunting, camping, or fishing, you'll enjoy smarter design, stronger construction, and superior insulation of Glacier Coolers. Visit them at glaciercoolers.com, promo code TRUTH at checkout, and save yourself 20% and get a kick-ass cooler for a working man's budget. And now with that, let's jump into the show with Dr. Strickland. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. You're listening to the DIY Report mini-series talking about deer movement with Dr. Bronson Strickland, part number 2. How's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. I'm really looking forward to talking about part number 2 here, because I think the first section that we did, at least for me, whenever I think about deer movement, it was nice to kind of get that bird's eye view of like what's happening to deer on the whole from a movement perspective, which helps you start to understand and maybe start to put some rhyme to the reason as to what they do individually. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is what deer are starting to do individually in terms of movement. And we'll just go ahead and kind of jump right into it, because we started talking about it a little bit in part 1 when we referenced bachelor groups, a few different times. So, when bachelor groups break up, what specifically is happening that is driving this, and how far will bucks move from their summer area or from their home range to their seasonal range when they do break up?
Okay, yeah, great question, Clint. So think about a bachelor group, during the summertime, during the growing season. Typically in most areas, that's when you have the most abundant vegetation or, food resources that are available. And corresponding with that, this is really important, you actually have this bachelor group because testosterone levels are really, really, really low. It's just baseline testosterone at that point in time. And bucks, for lack of a better word, they're able to tolerate each other. They don't have that the aggression that comes with testosterone. So what happens when that breakup is occurring, testosterone levels are rising, antlers are becoming fully formed, and then testosterone levels are really, when testosterone level peaks, that's of course when the velvet shedding occurs, and most of your bachelor groups have broken up by then. So it's one of those things where those groups a bachelor group, they can be together because they can tolerate each other, but furthermore, it's also because of the food resources that are available.
Right. So when they when that testosterone starts to kind of to pump, right, and it breaks them up, and they start to go hard-horned and stuff like that. So is there something environmentally that's happening that signals to them that this is now the time that their body should react that way? Like, is it, because I know when we talk about, and we'll talk about this in part 3 when we get into talking about the rut more specifically, but is there anything to do with the photo period that starts to kind of make this transition work for them?
Well, think of photo period, and that, again, for people, that's the ratio of daylight to darkness, and that ratio changes throughout the year. During the summertime, you have far more light than dark. So basically, photo period is a trigger, and it begins this cascading effect. And there's a whole bunch of different glands in the brain and so forth that stimulate the endocrine system to start producing more testosterone. But that's how it happens. So photo period would be the trigger that begins the increased production of testosterone. Testosterone is pulsing through their veins. Their behavior starts to change. It's kind of a cue that I don't want to tolerate, this guy anymore, and it's time for me to go somewhere else, to where I hang out in the fall,
right.
My fall home range.
Right. I think I heard you explain it at one point. I think it was you that explained it this way. It's like, just to kind of give reference to the folks out there listening that might have kids. I have a daughter who is 10, so she's hitting that like preteen era. And so when those hormones start changing, it's like, think about how easy or difficult it might be as they begin to change in your children, and how easily you're able to tolerate them. might be a good way to frame it, right?
Well, how many times, as someone who has two daughters,
right.
How many times have we heard people say, "Man, when they turn 13, they're completely a different person now.
Right.
What happened to my little Susie or whatever?"
Right.
Like, yeah, they are a different person now.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's happening on an annual scale with these bucks. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I could take that on an annual scale. I only want to ride that ride one time if it's all right with everyone. But so all right, so I want to shift gears here and talk now and talk just a little bit about pre-rut. So I'm curious to know that are there elements or distances of travel or characteristics of the pre-rut time of season that are related to movement? So are there certain types of expansion of movement or increased movement that starts to happen during this time of year, and how much so beyond what is typical, I guess?
Yeah, well, think of the pre-rut is so they're going to be, if they had a seasonal shift, a lot of them do, some of them don't, but a lot of them do. So they're basically building I like to think of it as their social network. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to learn who all is here, what all females are here, all the signpost behavior that you're familiar with. Mm-hmm. That's when, rubbing and scraping and, they're basically learning about the population that they're interacting with. Mm-hmm. Really don't see, as compared to the rut, you're not going to see these big daily or 2 or 3 day shifts. But it's mainly just more thoroughly exploring and working and understanding their fall home range.
Right. So is it fair to say that as that time happens, like you're going to start to see increased movement? So if we just use the example of if outside of pre-rut and before so let's take it this way. If during the summer they only move an hour a day, and I'm just making stuff up at this point, an hour a day, and then they hit the Bachelor group breakup and now they move 2 hours a day, and then once they hit pre-rut they move in daylight or move 3 hours a day consistently. Like, are we seeing that kind of consistently build so they're covering more ground as the season kind of progresses?
I don't know if it's that defined, Clint, and I think it would just vary a lot by individuals as well. We just see so much individual variation with these guys. Some of them just move more, and some of them are just so much more sedentary. It would have a lot to do with food as well, that we talked previously. How is food distributed on the property?
Right.
Does a buck have to get out and look for every bite, or can he stand in a few places and fill his rumen? So just a lot of variation. I'm sorry I can't give you a rule about that, but that's just kind of what I've seen.
No, and that makes me think of, during that same kind of time period, or maybe just slightly before pre-rut, what people refer to as the October lull. Like you kind of mentioned the idea of like how far does he have to move to find food, and that time of year is when you really kind of have acorns and stuff like that hitting the ground, to where it's, if they've picked the right kind of home range or seasonal range for that time of year, and they have an acorn crop that's close by, that buck doesn't have to move a whole lot, which would kind of say that maybe you don't see him that often during that time of the year. It's not that he's not moving, he's just having to move a lot less than he would typically have to. Is that fair?
And yeah, that's fair. And I'm not, I just wanted to comment on the October lull. I'm not a big believer in that. I can't say it's a myth buster thing yet. Hopefully when we get finished with this study, I can say there's any truth to it or not. But you got to think about this too, is in a lot of areas, October is when hunting really gets going, really into full swing. And what we have shown very well and very clearly is that when hunters start getting out in the woods, when they start pushing deer and disturbing deer, that is what changes their movement patterns a lot. So you may not be categorizing this as a rut phenomenon. It may be a disturbance phenomenon of why they're shutting down. And then so the deer, here's an alternative hypothesis. It might be that you used to see deer, whatever metric you were using, $3 a day.
Right.
And then during October, you didn't see maybe a buck every other day. Well, that may just be the response to all the human activity. And then November rolls around, and now we have rut behavior, and now you're seeing bucks again. So it wasn't necessarily that it was a lull because of any environmental condition or because it was the pre-rut. It may have just been a lull because their behavior changed from disturbance, and then it increased because of the rut.
Right. Which
kind of a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, no, that's cool. It's interesting too, because it would make it seem exponentially worse by comparison, right? Like when you get to rut and there is a lot more movement and you kind of come out of the, I'm using air quotes, the quote unquote lull. It kind of makes that time period where they're probably reacting, to your point, to environmental pressures that much more, slow than maybe it is in reality, because you're comparing it against the thing that you're hunting in, which is the rut during that movement phase.
You're comparing it to the gold standard, the rut.
Right. So it's like maybe we have to recalibrate our perspective a little bit as we go through the different times of year to kind of account for what we might or might not see. So you did mention a few moments ago, you started to kind of mention, talking about their individual kind of movement, and that they're each, slightly unique, and that, they have their kind of own way about how they're going to move at these different times and so forth. So, so an individual buck specifically, when it's checking doe bedding areas. And so now we're getting into, that pre-rut, or, maybe even tickling the beginning of rut a little bit. And when he's checking doe bedding areas, do they have a system or a pattern by which they check, or is it random? Is there like a number that they check, a number of bedding areas, or do they check as many as they can get to? So what's kind of their method for the doe bedding area kind of perusing, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we're really starting to dig into this. And in fact, one of our students, Ashley Jones, is actually looking at this with her project, and one of my colleagues in South Texas did a similar study down there. So we were kind of comparing this behavior in South Texas versus in Mississippi. In South Texas, there were fewer of the, what we called them was focal areas, mm-hmm. which basically was we think is like a doe social group, and down there in South Texas, it might be checking every couple days, whereas what we found out in Mississippi was that there's a lot more of these focal areas, and the bucks here are moving more often. And so Ashley, her first analyses, what they're showing is that a buck is checking these focal areas sometimes as few as every 6 hours, which to me as a hunter, when I hear that, I think, that means that buck is going to show himself during daylight hours.
Right. Yeah.
And so what we think, we're just kind of getting into this and trying to understand it, but probably a lot of that, Clint, has to do with deer density. Deer are far less dense there. And so maybe those focal areas where those does are hanging out are further apart. And so maybe it's a longer trip to get there. Maybe he hangs out there a little bit longer. And then maybe here in Mississippi, where they're more dense, these focal areas, is that they just check them more frequently.
That's interesting. So outside of the frequency or the time frame between checking, is there an ultimate number that they tend to get to, or is that again kind of possibly dictated by the density? So I guess what I'm looking for is like, is a buck focused on 3 specific doe bedding areas, or will they focus on as many as they can possibly get to in a reasonable amount of time?
Yeah, I would say the latter versus the former. So I would say within his range, that seasonal home range, what we were talking about previously, he's built his social network. He knows where these clusters of females are hanging out. He's probably going to do his best to check them as frequently as he can. Now he's still got to support his body. He's still got to stop and eat. He's still got to avoid hunters and things like that. But it's to his advantage to check as often as he can.
So, and you'd mentioned his home range is, as often as he can and within his home range. Have you ever heard of, or read a study or witnessed research that suggested that a buck would have 2 home ranges? And if by the off chance you have seen that, what would be the reason for them to have 2 home ranges?
I think we talked about it previously, what I call the dumbbell home range. Okay. Yes. But in what we found in our study, it's only about a third of the bucks have these. And we don't know. We hope that through this study we can get some greater insight, because we're also tracking hunter activity as well. And so you may have some of these bucks, and again, this is an early hypothesis here, but you may have some of these bucks that just do not tolerate disturbance as much as others. And it might be some cumulative threshold of, I'm getting disturbed, I'm smelling human scent all the time, all right, I'm going to bolt and go to this other area where disturbance is less. Or it may be driven by their stomach. It may be they know that they can capitalize on some particular suite of food resources at a particular time of year. So a year from now, Clint, I hope to have some better insight as to that.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because I'd be curious to follow up with you on that, just to kind of see. It's like, I'd be interested to know if you're seeing similar. So within a particular buck, if you're seeing him have that dumbbell kind of home range effect, and that he's finding similar habitat in both kind of places, and then one level up above that is, the deer that you're seeing across the spectrum of deer that you're following. Are you seeing them consistently kind of gravitating towards specific type of habitat that they're using consistently as a secondary home range, primary home range or secondary home range? Before we continue our conversation, let's talk about Wicked Tree Gear saws. Hardcore deer hunters need hardcore tools. Do yourself a favor and check out Wicked Tree Gear, the toughest hand saws and pull saws on earth. You buy it once, you buy it for life, backed by a lifetime guarantee. Right now, if you use the promo code TRUTH, you'll save 20% on your next purchase with free ground shipping. So head over to wickedtreegear.com and get a saw that's tough enough to work as hard as you hunt. Right.
We are going to dig into that very question. We've already started. What makes up these? And the answer, the preview here is that it's related to cover.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and furthermore, it's not just cover, but it's the type of cover. So, of course, you have to have cover that's going to provide them screening, literally where they become invisible to predator to human. But then also the type of cover that can simultaneously provide food is where they are selecting.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd love to follow up with you on that, because that's just kind of interesting. I was thinking it as you were mentioning, it'd be really cool to kind of see what similarities there were, overlaps there were between the different deer that are having secondary home ranges. But
yeah, and I want to dig into that, because again, I like sharing information for management. And so if we can figure out what is drawing a buck to this particular spot to bed and spend most of his time, then that's an opportunity for management.
Yeah, absolutely. And there would be all kinds of weekend warrior managers like me, that would love to hear information like that, to figure out how I can make my little honey hole just a little bit more attractive if I could.
Yeah, I'll be right there with you.
Yeah. So the next thing I want to talk about, and this is something that I think is very, discussed a lot, and I don't know that there's any concrete information out there, but I wanted to get your perspective on it. So the moon, very, I don't want to say controversial, necessarily, but you have lots of folks on both sides of the fence that it has an impact. You have lots of folks on the other side of the fence that don't believe that it has an impact at all. So, from your perspective, research that you've seen and so forth, and then even, put your hunter hat on for this one as well, from, just what you've witnessed as well. Does moon, in your opinion, have any impact on deer movement in general? So whether it's a red moon, an overhead, an underfoot moon, whatever the case might be, the backside of a full moon, there's all types of theories out there. Is there anything that you've seen that you can kind of say, yes, I've seen some consistency with this?
Isn't that so romantic? I mean, why do so many people gravitate towards this? I think it's kind of this mysterious thing, the moon and its impacts, and I guess it's fun to think about, but we have sliced this up about every way you can possibly do it. We've done it individually with individual deer in our pens. We've done it with free-ranging populations, and there's absolutely no effect that we can find with the moon. None whatsoever. It doesn't matter if it's dark, if the moonlight is bright. It doesn't matter if it's a full moon but there's cloud cover. We cannot find any relationship. And I keep coming back to this, Clint, and I don't mean to sound facetious with this, but this is what I come back to. is a deer is going to move every single day.
Right.
A deer has to fill its rumen every single day. There might be some subtle shifts from day to day as to when they do it, but you are guaranteed that a deer is going to move every single day to find food.
Right.
And then especially, when you add the rut to that, they're certainly going to move. So when we put all that together, and when we look, and people have looked at it from a buck's standpoint, his movements, we've looked at it from does, their movement in terms of and our angle, Clint, was the rut.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's all this after X, this moon and that moon, and it's going to stimulate the rut. And there's zero evidence for that. Absolutely none.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I personally don't really buy into it. So I had an odd experience. The first year I was like, you know what? I'm going to give the moon a shot. Got the moon guide. Was like, I'll follow this, and I wasn't going to base hunts on it necessarily, but I was just going to kind of pay attention to it whenever I did go out and hunt. And the first set I did, I saw what the red moon was, and it was telling me that, I should have movement around 4:30. I don't remember the exact time that it was, but let's just call it 4:30 for conversational purposes. And wouldn't you know that the only movement I saw the entire day was $3 at like 4:32. You know what I mean? It was one of those things, like,
right.
And I was like, you got to be kidding me. I was like, there might be something to this thing. And then every time after that, I've never really, it wasn't consistent. And then I also, I kind of stopped paying attention to it as well. I think even if there was something to it, I think there are certain states like Pennsylvania that has such significantly high pressure, significantly more than, many other states, that a lot of things that people will attribute to movement, which might just be a deer being a deer, doesn't happen in certain places because there are external kind of environmental factors that they're being impacted by that they might not be, experiencing in a state that has significantly lower pressure with significantly higher food, availability. Right. So
yeah, that's a good point. So like the case you're describing, the hunting pressure might override any of those other kind of natural pressures or tendencies.
Right, exactly. So it's like, so I'm always a little skeptical of those things where people feel like they can predict based on some, something that doesn't really have anything to do with their survival or their cover or their feeding necessarily, I guess is what I'm kind of getting at, because there's a lot of variables across different states and so on and so forth that kind of impact that you really can't draw a bead on it. But
there's so many interactions that are going on that are going to affect when a deer is going to move or not. It's just so difficult to isolate it to just one thing. And Clint, you mentioned earlier about confirmation bias, and so what you just described would be a great example of it for some people that take it so far. I'm only going to hunt when it's between 30 and 40 degrees.
Right.
And then you go out and see deer when it's 30 to 40 degrees, and then it just reaffirms. You just become more and more entrenched.
Right.
But if you're not randomly sampling other times, other temperatures. So how do you know?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I was going to say, if you only ever hunt when it's 30 to 40 degrees, you're only ever going to see deer when it's 30 to 40 degrees. So,
absolutely.
So, a wrong clock is correct twice a day. You know what I mean? It's like it's that type of thing. So, but so the next thing I want to talk about a little bit, and I'm interested to get your perspective on this, because as a hunter, this is something that I do follow. I don't subscribe wholesale to all these necessarily, where I don't pin my hopes and dreams to them per se. But I will pay attention to them, and we'll kind of go through them in like a bullet point fashion here. But how do you feel the movement is impacted by the weather in general? When I say the weather in general, what I'm referring to is rain and precipitation, wind, the different, variations in wind speed, is there movement whenever it's slower or faster or whatever the case is, and then barometric pressure. Are any of those things kind of impactful in terms of predicting deer movement, in your opinion?
Well, it's not my opinion. We have some data that confirm there is some merit to that, but It comes with a really, really big caveat. So this is not going to be one of those incremental relationships where if we increase wind speed by 5%, there's going to be an increase in deer movement by 5%. Mm-hmm. When you look at the data, you only see, like with wind, for example, you only see changes at very, very extreme events. So it is extremely windy And literally how we have it sliced up, we use a term called standard deviation. It's how far an observation is from the mean.
Yep.
So basically, you've got to be on the bottom 5%. The rare 5% of the, say, wind being calm, or the rare 5% when it's really, really windy. But in between, in that other 90% of wind conditions, you don't see any relationship whatsoever.
Wow, that's interesting.
And surprisingly with wind, a lot of people say, well, heck, it's so windy outside. Oh, that's another good confirmation bias story here. Well, if it's really, really windy, heck, the deer aren't going to move.
Right.
Well, also, when it's really, really windy in the wintertime, it's usually uncomfortable for you to hunt.
Right.
And so you don't go that often.
Yeah.
But the data are clear. When it's really, really calm, when it's rarely calm, and when it's rarely windy, actually deer movements increase.
That's interesting.
And the same thing occurs for pressure.
Barometric pressure even, huh?
Barometric pressure. Uh-huh.
Wow, that's interesting. So there's not an envelope of barometric pressure in which they... So let me ask it this way. Are you suggesting, is it when pressure is rarely high is when you're seeing it most often? Because it's one of the things you hear a lot of folks talk about. It's like they're looking for light precip, a 15-ish mile per hour wind in a high pressure day on the backside of the front.
Yep, it is. It's the drastic increase in pressure is when we saw it. But interestingly, with pressure, it was highly variable. So whatever that trigger was for deer, some of them increased their movement. I mean, literally like double, triple the amount, and some of them didn't. So we saw an overall effect when you take the average from that group. There was a change in the average, meaning the average, they moved more on that extreme barometric pressure, but it was not uniform across deer. And I don't have an answer for that, other than just, again, deer individuals and some of the environmental prompts cause some deer to move, and other times it doesn't.
Right. Well, at least I know that my assessment of watching the weather and barometric pressure isn't necessarily for naught during the season, because as much time as I spend staring at weather apps from like mid-September through the end of November is not completely in vain. So that's good to know that I haven't wasted all that time necessarily.
Well, just keep in mind that this coming season that it's not going to be the little shifts. It's got to be the big changes.
Right.
To stimulate movement. Yeah.
Well, cool. So I think that wraps up our part number 2, talking about more, individual deer and what's kind of creating some of the movement that we're seeing as hunters. And with that, I think we can wrap this one up. And I'm looking forward to the why behind the rut for part number 3.
Absolutely. I look forward to it, Clint. Thank you.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank Dr. Strickland for joining. Be sure to check out his podcast, Deer University, for in-depth reviews of the science behind all things whitetail. And also, follow them on Facebook and Instagram at MSU Deer Lab. That's Mississippi State University Deer Lab. We'd, of course, like to thank all of you for listening. And if you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast. We'd be super appreciative if you'd be able to do those 2 things for us. Before we shut this thing down, we'd like to give a big shout out to our partners that continue to help us make this podcast possible. Wicked Tree Gear, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Trophy Ridge, Ozonics, Obsession Bows, Tecumani Seed, Glacier Coolers, Ramcat Broadheads, Trophy Taker Rests, and Dead Downwind. And until next time, we'll see y'all.
Show you through the door. I ain't welcome anymore. A long time coming, if it all. It takes a special knowing to color for damaged heads, broken letters. Rationalize yourself in numbers, but I